Hello and welcome. My name is Justin Hardman. I'm joining you here from Hong Kong this nice Saturday afternoon to have a session led by Fatima, who is going to be talking about the impact of COVID restrictions on children with special educational needs in the early years. She's going to be sharing some of the research she's working on. I'm personally very interested to hear this. I think COVID is one of those things that we feel like we want to move on from, and I feel like sometimes we don't talk about it as much as we should in terms of the impacts. And as someone with young kids, I'm particularly interested as well. So with that, I'll hand over to you, Fatima, and of course, please do drop any questions or provocations in the chat, whether you're joining us on any of the platforms that allow that. If you're on Twitter, feel free to jump over one of the other platforms where you can add questions. And we'll be addressing those towards the end. Okay, over to you.
Thank you, Justin, for the very nice introduction. Hello, everyone. Whether you're listening live or will watch the recording later, I hope this research presentation helps shed light on some of educators' experiences teaching children with special educational needs and in the early years during the COVID-19 crisis. This research was conducted as part of my master's project at the University of Hong Kong in 2022. I am very thankful to Professor Frank Rickard for co-authoring the paper, and the paper is published in the Journal of Research in Special Educational Needs. I also want to thank 21st Century Learning and Justin Hardman for organizing this online streaming. Although, as Justin said in his introduction, COVID-19 seems a long time ago, its prolonged nature, the restrictions in Hong Kong especially were in place for 2 years. And it's left a profound impact for schools and educators, and they're noticing learning losses and skills. And supporting young learners in the current educational provision has become extremely important. I am interested to know of your experiences as educators post-COVID of children's development and your observations. Please feel free to drop in any comments and questions in the chat. For ease, we refer to children with special educational needs as CSEN in this paper. Acknowledging, being informed, and sharing experiences of these impacts through dialogue will help schools and educators in meeting children where they are at in the current learning and supporting needs of CSEN. In addition, reflecting on the COVID-19 crisis learning will help schools and educators better prepare and inform knowledge for any unforeseen school closures in future crises or during climate and political disturbances. We're facing a world where it's an evolving world and things keep happening, and we never know when we face school closures again. Please do type any questions that you have in the chat, as I mentioned, as we go along. I will aim to present for 45 minutes and have 15 minutes in the end for Q&A. Sorry, I'm just going to switch my slide here.
Okay, you can switch the slides right inside the stream here.
Okay, I got it. Thank you. Thank you. So thank you, Justin, for your help. Before I start discussing the research paper, a short introduction of myself. I was an early years practitioner and have worked in Montessori classrooms for more than 10 years. After pursuing my degree at the University of Hong Kong in MEd, I found myself immersed and connected to research. Finding out about people's lived experiences through qualitative research is a keen area of interest. I started my doctorate in 2023 with the Institute of Education at University College London. My doctorate project will explore the meaning of quality for children, parents, and practitioners in early childhood settings using participatory research methods and specifically the mosaic approach to include children's voices and perspectives in the early years. So what I want to do in today's presentation is I will draw from the published paper and highlight key aspects, starting with the background of the study and what was known about CSEN's experiences from previous studies, and then establish the motivation for this study. Next, I will discuss the research questions based on what was known, and then the study's method and participants. I will then discuss the main findings and then some of the recommendations and further research that we propose. I do just want to add here that I am unable to discuss the paper in length and detail, and you can read the paper in your own time after this presentation for details. It is an open access paper, and I will share the link with you at the end of the presentation. The details are also available on 21st Century profile page. Before I highlight the background of this study, I would like you to take a moment to reflect on these pictures that show the changed nature of early years learning from face to face, hands on learning to online learning using technology and computers during the COVID-19 crisis. With this reflection, and I think these images are really important to keep in mind while I'm discussing the background and some of the findings of the research. I want to briefly describe the background and context of COVID-19 crisis and early years education. So as we all know that in 2020, COVID-19 was declared a pandemic and containment strategies were implemented globally. And some of these strategies were school closures that we're discussing, isolation, quarantines, mask wearing. I think we are all very, when we're reflecting, we have all lived and experienced these containment strategies. The spread of the virus also came in waves. So there were periods of high infections, and during these periods, the modes of learning were adjusted. And it was either face to face, hybrid, with a combination of face to face and online, or just online when there were periods of high infection. So this study was conducted during the fifth wave in Hong Kong, which was March 2022, when schools were closed again and learning was completely online. Educators also had 2 years of experience by then of teaching online because since January 2020. Why do we choose to focus on early childhood and the age group between birth to 8 years? That's typically described as early years or early childhood period, is because early childhood is an important period when we are aware that exceptional brain development happens, and it provides a critical window for education and learning. During this time, children's experiences in their daily environments build foundations that are critical for holistic development, language, social, cognitive, and emotional learning. Therefore, this is a crucial time for children's development, and disruptions such as the ones caused by the pandemic can hamper healthy growth and development. In addition, children with special educational needs and being in the early years, they have specific learning and developmental difficulties, which make them more vulnerable to the COVID induced disruptions in learning. And I do want to highlight here that before the pandemic, there were already mixed views in the early years community regarding the use of technology in in young learners. Although technology use was seen beneficial in providing interactive apps and elements to engage CSEN, yet play and social interactions for children in the early years and CSEN were seen essential for them to learn and practice their social skills. Some CSEN, they already struggle with social and communication difficulties, and in face-to-face learning, it is where teachers can facilitate the social play, which was not possible in online learning. So what was known before we conducted this research? So before conducting any research, researchers will conduct a literature review, which is to be able to understand what has already been studied and known about any topic. This then enables researchers to see where there are knowledge gaps and how the study being conducted can add value and build on what has already been known. So previously conducted studies showed that CSEN experienced challenges and some positives from online learning. Due to prolonged online learning, children were showing adverse developmental outcomes in academic learning and skills. I briefly highlight these to explain the motivation of the study and how the findings make contribution to knowledge in the field of early years education. So, online learning posed challenges in CSEN's learning. Some of these challenges were navigating the online systems, accessing the systems, keeping CSEN motivated in learning tasks. There was a high reliance on adult support, and overall, during the pandemic, CSEN's social emotional problems worsened. Studies reported increased anxiety and behavioral problems in CSEN because their routines and their structures changed. And for CSEN, the routines and structures are found to be extremely important because there is predictability. They know what's going to happen, they know what's coming in their day. Studies also highlighted positives for a minority of CSEN in learning from home. There was reduced pressure for some of them. They had better sleep and mood, more free time because there was less scheduling and additional time to pursue creative play at home. Since there was no physical school, CSEN experienced less physical bullying incidents and peer meanness, which can be the peer meanness can be seen more in kindergartners. However, incidence of cyberbullying in the early years is unclear and under-researched area. World Bank and UNICEF reports already in 2022 were showing that the prolonged online learning and not attending consistent face-to-face schooling had resulted in CSEN, young learners and vulnerable children experiencing learning losses in academic learning and skills. This figure, it might be a little bit hazy or a little bit blurred because I've taken it from the research paper. It gives you the snapshot of the prolonged school closures in Hong Kong. And starting from January 2020, which was the onset of the COVID-19 crisis, until April 2022. As I mentioned before, Hong Kong went through 5 waves and the modes of schooling changed between online and hybrid. And in hybrid, there was a combination of face to face and online learning. So, given that I've already shared what was known about the topic at the time of when this research was conducted, the motivation of the study was to find out how CSEN were impacted depending on the type of CSEN and severity of needs. So, overall, while research had shown learning losses, the long term implications on developmental outcomes were unclear. Therefore, this study explored educators' perspectives, as educators are an important group after parents responsible for children's learning and well being, enabling to understand CSEN's or CSEN's online learning experiences. The research explored these 3 questions from the perspectives of early years educators teaching CSEN and online lessons, and also school leaders' experiences. And these school leaders were responsible for special educational needs provision. 3 main themes were explored based on the study's background and what was already known. So, the challenges for CSEN, some of the positive aspects, and the adverse developmental outcomes on learning during the COVID induced restrictions. And these were all from educators' perspectives. Once a study has its motivation and the research questions, then the next step is to establish the research methods or tools that will enable the researcher to answer the research questions accurately and meaningfully. As a researcher, my worldview is that knowledge can be created by understanding the lived experiences of people. Therefore, qualitative research design was the most suitable, and I use semi-structured interviews to understand educators' experiences, using an established interview protocol and follow-up questions, enabling deeper exploration of participants' experiences. The participants were 21 educators from 2 private kindergartens and 2 private primary schools in Hong Kong. All these schools are inclusive schools where CSEN are taught with peers in mainstream classes. The participants were selected based on experiences of teaching CSEN online in the early years, kindergarten, and lower primary. And the cutoff age, because we wanted to focus in the early years, was 8 years. The participants were classroom teachers and educational assistants, and the school leaders were either vice principals and SEN coordinators. And we also had a one SEN professional who is a specialist providing SEN services in Hong Kong. Interviews were conducted on Zoom because, of course, it was a fifth wave, and the possibility of any in-person interviews was not there because of isolation regulations. And it was a period of high stress for teachers. However, most educators, except to participate in the study, two declined that they had immense workload. And we were very glad to have a chance to share, and they were very glad to share their perspectives. Interviews lasted between 20 to 40 minutes. Some interviews even went up to 60 minutes. So, what I did was, after the interviews, transcripts were generated and then they were coded. The codes were combined to generate themes with the three overarching themes as the research questions, with the subsequent sub themes, which I will share in the findings later. And I think it's really important here that it was that ethical considerations were strictly adhered to, because these were participants were all teachers, and to ensure participants' identities were not revealed, all data was pseudonymized. And I have highlighted here in the findings participants' pseudonymized codes. And the pseudonymized means that the identities, their names were taken out and they were assigned lettered and alphabets to protect their identities. Here, this slide shows you the breakup of the 21 educators. As you can see, there were kindergarten and primary teachers and leadership personnel. And I have assigned the kindergarten and primary teachers alphabets, and the leadership were assigned numbers. You can see the participants' ages and gender and what role they had in their respective schools. We also had taken participants' backgrounds and ethnicities, but we haven't highlighted that because that could risk revealing their identities. But participants were from different nationalities and different backgrounds. Okay, so next I will discuss the findings of the study and discuss the sub-themes in the three overarching themes that we talked about. So the challenges, the positives, and the adverse developmental outcomes of learning. So looking at the challenges, from educators' account, CSEN's experiences, that is the challenges and positives, actually differed depending on the type and severity of children's special educational needs. So the table on the right shows the different types of SEN that were mentioned by the educators. The most prominent SEN mentioned by the educators was autism, followed by global developmental delay, and then ADHD, which is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. So, according to the educators, for example, autistic children were found to go better academically than other children. However, their social skills suffered. Children who had ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia, and also other developmental disorders found online learning challenging both academically and socially, given their unique needs. The quote from P7, the SEN professional, highlights this. With the iPad in the background, children with ADHD were rolling on beds and somersaulting on the floor with the need for movement. This shows that children with ADHD, due to their constant need for movement and high energy, were unable to focus on the screen to successfully access online learning. Educators reiterated the importance and value of face-to-face learning in the early years and for CSEN. It was seen essential for CSEN and children in the early years to have play-based and experiential learning to fully access the curriculum and for optimal and holistic development. So, as PB, a kindergarten educator, said, for children's social emotional development and communication skills, online is not really the way to do it. In educators' perspective, online learning created a disconnect from learning for CSEN. CSEN learn better with a physical presence in the classroom environment as they have access to classroom resources. The lack of physical presence made it challenging for educators to identify CSEN's needs and provide appropriate support and adaptations. And also for some CSEN, depending on the severity of needs, uh, they were distractible and had a low attention span to focus on online lessons. Therefore, for educators, online learning served as as they called it, as PA called it, a positive distraction, a need of the hour to keep connections with children during the COVID-19 crisis. So there was a recognition that yes, okay, online learning provided a means to connect with children. Something was better than nothing, but it was definitely not how early years education needs to be. However, if SEN teachers delivered one on one lessons to CSEN online using creative means, needs matching CSEN's interests, such as if educators mentioned if in one on one lessons, if they connected the lessons with children's interests like animals or space, then CSEN were found to be more engaged. And this was smaller group one on one lessons. Learning from the home environment also posed challenges for CSUN. The home environment lacked routine and consistency. Also, there were distractions at times in the environment that teachers could not control. In the classroom, teachers were responsible and they noticed these distractions and were able to divert CSUN and offer support. CSEN's independence in the home environment was of utmost concern. Many CSEN were heavily supported by adults, and the adult support also varied. It was parents, grandparents, and it could also be helpers. So it was difficult for teachers to assess whether the work that was done by CSEN was actually their own work or it was heavily supported by the adults. As PN highlighted, they are backtracking because they have someone beside them doing all the work. Another educator, PM, said that during the Zoom lessons, there was like a hand reaching over them. They're not even able to mute or unmute themselves. And this was the heavy support, the very high support that CSEN had. Therefore, educators preferred for CSEN to be present in school for them to balance support and independent work. So now while we have looked at some of the challenges, we also see the other side of the story, which is always important to see, especially and to find positives in difficult circumstances and adversities. I do acknowledge here that the COVID crisis was an overall difficult time for CSEN and families. The positives were experienced by a minority of CSEN, and this was again dependent on the type and severity of their needs. So while the home environment had difficulties, had pitfalls, the home environment also was a karma space for some children with CSEN. And learning from the home environment was proved beneficial. So for some autistic children and children with sensory integration, learning from the home environment offered less sensory overload, fewer distractions, and a more comfortable physical space, thus improving attention. In the classroom, the class sizes of 30 can be very intimidating and busy for some autistic children and children who have sensory integration. The lighting can bother them, the noise can bother them. But in the home environment, it was quieter, and they had the autonomy to control the lighting, to control the room temperature, and just being on the screen had there were less distractions, so they could focus better. Educators also observed that a few autistic children and children who were shy and those selectively mute were seen to come out of their shell, as said by one of the educators, P1, and they noticed increased expression in these children. Educators sensed that these children were more comfortable initiating interactions and sharing ideas in online lessons than in face to face classrooms. Again, speaking in a group of 30 children in circle time or even in small groups can be intimidating for some children. But online, being able to put a Zoom hand up and just being able to speak in an online setting was less intimidating and more comfortable for some children. Educators also reported that learning from home provided children experiencing anxiety and social developmental challenges the autonomy to cope with emotions in their own time and privacy. Learning from home allowed CSEN to turn off the camera without being noticed by peers while coping with sensitive emotions. And educators shared that it was common for CSEN to experience these difficult emotions and meltdowns in face to face classes. And in face to face classes and learning, they felt conscious of being watched by their peers, and their peers would talk about them. They felt they were judged. Whereas online, it was less noticeable. They could just turn off the camera on Zoom and then could join the class again when they were ready. Lastly, educators also found that for some CSEN, the additional time while learning at home presented opportunities to pursue personal interest due to less scheduled school timetabling pressures and extracurricular activities. In PN's observation, children at the lower primary P7, 5 to 7 year olds, they were more creative than she had ever seen before. And according to PN, this was because they had more time to engage in creative play, like Lego for longer periods of time. So this table here gives a snapshot of the sub-themes and participant quotes that highlight the home environment as the karma space. It's really interesting to read some of the participant quotes and the SEN characteristics. You can go into the main study and take a look later if you like. And the next positive that the educators reported was learning with technology. Although educators thought online learning was not the desired mode of learning, which I shared in the challenges, um, they also felt that children had gained valuable technology skills, which they wouldn't have otherwise gained if it wasn't for the COVID-19 crisis. Educators also noticed that online activities can be captivating and help CSEN connect with learning. According to PE, and PE was referring to a child who was in the environment for some time and was unable to connect with the classroom activities and peers. Uh, and PE said when it was online was the first time when I could see the spark in his eyes because this child actually was able to connect with some of the creative apps and some of the online applications that the teachers were using. Moreover, the increased expression that CSEN attained in their home environments aligns with educators describing technology as an alternate means of expression that increases student agency, voice, and choice, such as using the Padlet to share photos and to write thoughts, voice to text recording, videos, online art, the option of the Zoom chat box. So, writing your comments, writing thoughts on the Zoom chat box rather than children having to speak up. And these platforms provided an alternate means for children to express themselves. P1 described it as giving them the opportunity to express themselves in a less socially pressured way. In this theme of our findings, we highlight some of the adverse developmental outcomes of learning. These are relevant for CSEN and for all children in the early years. Here, we do acknowledge that children's learning, attainment, and skills were not directly measured. We did not conduct any assessments directly with children to actually know what the exact learning losses were. And the study is just reporting educators' perceptions, given educators' knowledge and observations of teaching CSEN. Since the onset of the pandemic, Hong Kong children and educators had to wear masks in face-to-face classroom settings for more than 2 years. I think it was about 2.5 years that the mask wearing remained a regulation in Hong Kong. Reflecting on this period in P4's view, a kindergarten child today is a 3-year-old born living with COVID. their immune system is lacking, and they haven't developed normally like a child living in pre COVID times. Mandatory mask wearing in schools had limited young children's natural curiosity, example, putting things in their mouth, that educators considered necessary for development of healthy immunity. Educators also shared their perceived adverse effects of mandatory mask wearing on CSEN's social emotional development. Upon return to school intermittently during the waves, educators noticed that CSEN were unable to read social cues and facial expressions. As P2 said, obviously, with mask on faces, they're not used to seeing expressions, they don't know emotions. The next sub theme in the adverse learning outcomes is regarding the primary one school starters. Teachers felt that most children who started primary school in 2021 lacked school readiness skills. These skills included sharing with peers, problem solving, verbal skills for expression, anger resolution, emotional regulation, and self management. One of the teachers, PG, shared about a girl who joined the school in September 2021. And PG said, you can tell there is something lost. And she's not a SEN child. She just doesn't have school experience. And this child was just not settling into the school environment. In P7's observation, typically developing children and CSEN attending kindergarten and primary school experienced heightened separation anxiety when face to face classes resumed. Separation anxiety is normally experienced by young children when they first start school and they separate from their parents, and it fades after a few days as they settle down. If we are parents of young children, Justin, you mentioned you had young kids too. You probably know how separation anxiety is common and how it fades over time when children settle. However, after COVID 19, when school did resume intermittently during the waves, educators experienced children displaying prolonged anxiety and taking longer to settle in the classrooms. So while PM had a few children with severe attention issues in her class, she found that the rest of the class was also unsettled and it was very difficult to learn as a whole class. As PM said, all 30 of them together, you can't even get a sentence out without something happening. This was very unusual. Before the pandemic, there would be fewer unsettled children in a classroom, and teachers did not experience the classrooms being this unsettled, making it challenging to deliver the curriculum effectively. The impact on CSEN's academic and social skills emerged as another perceived adverse consequence on school closures. There was a greater concern amongst educators for CSEN's undermined social skills than academic skills, as highlighted by P2. Normally, it's academically when parents are saying, oh, they are behind. But there's been a definite difference in social skills that needs to be worked on. P1 further elaborated on the concern for CSEN's social skills. Especially with the cohort that came into K1 this year, we saw a huge change compared to cohorts we've had the years before. As children really struggle to play together, even though we have only done a little bit of assessment recently, the children are making progress and are actually achieving outcomes. But it's that play part. Although assessments were harder to conduct on Zoom, teachers felt that the limited assessments conducted showed that CSEN had progress and continued to achieve academic outcomes. In some cases, as with PM's primary one class, academics is even stronger, maybe because they've had that one on one with home support. Academically, an autistic child has not really needed anything. However, PN felt differently and said half of the children in her primary two class had alphabet and number reversals at the start of the year, which was very uncommon. The exact academic losses, again, were unclear at the time of the study, and I'm sure now schools, when they've gone back, they have done assessments to assess the exact learning losses and to provide the academic support that the children needed. So, looking at the social skills, overwhelmingly, the most significant adverse effect of online learning for CSEN that educators experienced in the classes was the deprivation in social skills. This is highlighted by PK scored. Many of our children have less developed social interaction skills, and in online learning, they struggle to practice the tools that we are trying to teach them. Educators talked about social difficulties worsening, which was observed in recess play in the playground when CSEN returned to school intermittently during the waves. Lower primary teachers shared the extensive challenges they observed on the playground due to a lack of prior socialization in children during online learning. CSEN were involved in frequent playground disputes, requiring teachers to mediate. Um, and P1 said there were a lot of situations where it was even kind of bordering on bullying. The playground, as a big, open, and unstructured space, heightened anxiety levels and posed difficulties for emotional regulation in CSEN. Educators also shared their concerns about identifying children's SEN as early as possible to provide adequate support towards improving learning outcomes. During online learning, teachers were prudent in referring children for diagnostic assessments, given the lack of face to face and consistent schooling. And they were erring on the side of caution. It was harder for educators to assess the difficulties of children who had started primary school in September 2021 or joined school in January 2022 due to the short time spent in face to face school. This is highlighted by PM's quote. Potentially, there are some children that I personally believe, from my experience, may have SEN, but I don't think that they will get assessed until later because we have been told that we need to give these children a chance. A child who's got a special need, such as autism, you kind of overlook them because you put it down to be living with COVID related and blame the speech problems to mask wearing, according to P4. Finally, educators stressed that CSEN would need time and adjustments to adapt to school routines again. An example was given by P7 in referring to children with ADHD, explaining when they return to school, it will be a rude shock for them to sit down and apply themselves as appropriate in the classroom. Thus, educators stressed to continue to adapt the curriculum to emphasize on the essential learning essential skills than the academic skills, and some of these skills are group work, building independence, sense of belonging, expressive skills, working in group. Social skills were especially highlighted by the educators, and P1 added to be more flexible with the curriculum and adapt the unit of inquiry towards expressing feelings, building friendships, and developing basic play and social skills than prioritizing academics. Although so now we look at the reflections and recommendations and what can we draw from the findings of this study that we can implement in our pedagogical practices in this post-COVID era. So, although the benefits reported by the educators were limited to some children and outweighed by the challenges, retaining the valuable elements will help educators and parents in informing best pedagogical practices for CSAN with a blend of technology and play based learning. Given the findings highlight how technology use increased expression and engagement in learning for some children, leveraging technology use where beneficial, and of course, retaining the essence of face to face learning may prove beneficial in CSEN's learning outcomes. Leveraging the use of pandemic evolved technology like video recordings, Padlets, voice to text. There are some really good creative apps that some of the educators also mentioned that they were using, can provide less intimidating and yet effective platforms for CSEN to share their thoughts with confidence rather than speaking in classroom settings, which can be intimidating and overwhelming for some autistic children and children who are shy and reserved. As school routines have been re-established, a balance between structured and self-driven activities must be attained for CSEN to promote and strengthen pandemic-attained creative skills, more opportunities to engage in free play and be less rushed for where possible. So even in our school settings, wherever possible, to have times when children are not following the timetable strictly and have some open time to pursue free play, even as parents at home, to make sure that we don't overschedule children, and young children are not running from one activity to the other, but also have some open time to pursue free play. Given the lack of development in social skills at the resumption of face to face schooling, teachers suggest a shift from filling in the gaps in academic knowledge. So, shifting our focus from academic knowledge towards fostering the essential life skills, the school readiness skills, to facilitate CSEN's adjustment in regular schooling and to ensure the right supports are there to meet children where they are at in their learning. Instead of having a view where children should be, we have a view this is where a child is and what can school do, what support can be implemented in classrooms to meet the children's needs. We recommend future research based on our findings and some areas that are unclear. So, although the benefits reported by the educators were limited to some children and outweighed by the challenges, I'm sorry, I'm just repeating the previous slide. So, in future research, we are looking at the playground disputes. And what is unclear to us is whether the short term display of the social communicative difficulties were actually genuine bullying incidents and peer meanness in children, or was it simply the lack of these social communication difficulties? So, post pandemic, as children are back in their routines, it would be good to research and look into these bullying incidents in the playground for CSEN. Our educators in this study did not mention any incidents of cyberbullying. Cyberbullying incidents have been found in adolescents and lower primary children. There have been studies that have shown the incidents. During online learning, children were heavily supported by the parents, so were unclear whether cyberbullying incidents were happening. But post pandemic, the technology that children are using, and parents are probably not monitoring as much, it is important to see the cyber research more on on cyberbullying incidents. And that's all from me. I have just about finished in the 45 minutes as I had promised. Thank you for taking the time and joining this session. If you have any questions, feel free to type in the chat, and Justin will help administer those. Also, if you would like to get in touch or have any reflections or questions, I would love to hear from you. You can contact me via email, LinkedIn, and there's also the link to the published study. And these have all been included in the speaker's profile on the 21st Century website. Thank you. Justin, over to you now.
Thank you so much. That was a fantastic presentation, a lot of information there. And yeah, please feel free to drop any questions you have in the chat. I see we have one already, but I would like to just start out with, I mean, it's sort of maybe a little repetition of what you talked about, but you know, if we have another pandemic, you know, a year from now or 10 years from now, and somebody's researching online and they find this recording, what would you like to communicate to that person about, you know, what should schools do if they need to, you know, do this remote learning again for kids with special educational needs?
Thank you, Justin. Oh, wow, it's a difficult question to answer because our world is changing so rapidly. And the way the technology and the geopolitical situation changes in the world from week to week and month to month, 10 years time is extremely difficult to predict. However, I do think one message would be very important is to really have importance on the socialization, on the social skills. Academic learning, given if you're looking at 10 years down the road, there'll be more apps, there'll be AI. The academic learning we will be able to support it, but it's those human interactions and the social skills that we will still need to support, because that will always remain the essence of early childhood education. So I think that will be my message.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. Actually, someone has asked in the chat here, Lucy, she said, do you have any recommended lists of apps that you spoke about?
Lucy, that's a really good question. And some of the educators actually had mentioned some of the apps that they were using. I have it in my master's appendices. I'm happy to share that. I don't know how, Justin, would that, I'm not sure if you could suggest the best way to
Yeah,
share that.
if you share it, we can post it on the next to the recording.
Perfect. I will do that, Lucy, as a follow-up.
That's great. And here's an interesting question from Shaz. Hi, Shaz. How are you? Thanks so much. I was wondering whether there are any gender-specific outcomes of the research.
No, Shazada, we didn't have any gender-specific outcomes. The gender-specific outcomes, if I did a deeper analysis, probably in some of the educators, they emerged. We have more female educators than male educators. But we actually didn't even do a gender-based analysis, because in just to answer the research questions, we just looked at the general perspectives of children with special education needs.
Okay. I wonder, the question I had in terms of like differences was, did you notice, did the research get into, or maybe it didn't specifically get at this, but I'm curious what your response is between the educators in different schools. Every school did remote learning in a different way, right? They have different modalities, different, ways of communicating with parents, different expectations about how long you're online or offline. Did you get into any of that at all in terms of how the schools actually did it versus, obviously the inherent, challenges of doing online learning?
I think, Justin, because my sample was from private schools in Hong Kong, and I think we've acknowledged that one of the limitations of the study as well, that we didn't include different types of schools or public schools, and I think different socioeconomic groups as well. So I think the study participants and the parents and the families involved in this study, they all were, I would say, well-to-do families, all had access to internet. So then no, the study didn't have so many differences in terms of how the online learning was administered. There were a few minor differences, like one of the schools sent learning packs home, whereas actually doing everything online. So the parents were actually going to pick up the learning packs, and then there were more hands-on activities than having everything online. So there were those minor differences, but nothing major in ways online learning was conducted. And also in terms of the special educational needs provision, one or two schools, there were four schools included, one or two schools had better provision. I wouldn't say better, but a different provision for doing one-on-one and breakout rooms for children with special educational needs. So they were making sure that the academic learning, and they were spending that time and keeping up those relationships with them.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. Another question here from Lucy. Some CSENs did not attend online learning. Do we know if there was any difference in social emotional development between those who were there and those that opted out?
Lucy, I think based on what our participants said, that it was actually a pity. I think one of the participants, and I think that's the beauty of qualitative research, some of the participant quotes remain with you even after years. So one of the kindergarten teachers actually called it catastrophic, that some of the CSEN who could actually have benefited by attending online learning did not, because their parents felt like it was too much pressure and their parents didn't want them to attend. So no, we didn't notice any differences specific in social emotional development, because we didn't measure anything. This is just based on what educators perceived and their experiences. But I'm sure now if schools are doing more assessments, then they have a better idea of the learning losses.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. One, question that I had sort of related to that is, do you think that the feedback that you would have gotten, in these interviews would be very different if you'd done the interviews, a year later, once we're kind of more clear from the pandemic? Because it sounds like you did the interviews right when we're still in it, right? And I just wonder what your thoughts are on that.
That's a very good question, Justin. And you're asking me a 1 year later, or I'm also thinking a 1 year before. So March 2022, we already were in 2 years of the pandemic. And I think the hardest part of the pandemic was when educators were not familiar with the online systems, and on a very short notice they had to implement online learning, and they were still trying to navigate these systems. But by the time I did the study, they were actually familiar with the online systems because they had done them for 2 years. However, the rapid changes that were happening in Hong Kong with the social isolation rules, quarantines, all of that was also playing a part. And I think here it's important to Justin add that there was a second part to this study as well, which was actually educators' well-being, which I haven't talked about in today's presentation because we are actually, Professor Frank and I are actually writing a manuscript and are going to publish it. So that actually did show that how the prolonged nature really impacted educators' well-being as well. So yes, I had asked educators a question that if you're looking at your personal and professional well-being a year before and a year from now, it was drastically different. It was deteriorated by March 2022. So a year later, of course, I can predict that it would have improved because they were not in it, but they were just reflecting on it. So the timing of the interviews does make a difference in the findings that the study shows.
Yeah. It's I think it's on the one hand, it might make you more objective maybe, but then maybe you also sort of, I think there's an element of like, we just sort of suppress that stuff, right, and move on from it and think, oh, that'll never happen again. But I think, it could happen again, right? And that's why I think research like this is very important.
And I think that's a very important point, Justin, that we don't know when there could be, like Hong Kong gets typhoons, when there are any political unrest. Like if you just look around the world, there's just so much uncertainty, and we just don't know when we would have to go online again. And I think having reflections, having an understanding of what it was like for children with special educational needs, then educators can actually bear that in mind and have provision in place.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's been wonderful having this conversation and being able to dive more deeply into it. I don't know if there's any other questions in the chat. It looks like we're out of questions. So I really appreciate your time today and your sharing. We'll add those links if you send them on the presentation page and post that on the website as well. So thanks again.
Great. Thank you, Justin, for your time and for organizing this.
No worries. Okay. Have a good afternoon. Bye.
Bye.